Norway, 867 CE. The longship beaches on the rocky shore of Northumbria and Viking warriors pour onto English soil. But this raid is different. Among the captives is King Allah, the ruler who had previously executed the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lothbrok by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes. The Vikings have not forgotten, and they have not forgiven. What King Allah is about to experience is not simply execution, but a ritual so barbaric that it would be whispered about in horrified tones for the next 1,000 years. They call it the Blood Eagle, and it represents the pinnacle of Viking cruelty, a punishment that combined religious sacrifice, theatrical violence, and systematic torture into a single horrifying act designed to send the victim's soul screaming into the afterlife. Before we sail into the dark waters of Viking brutality, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next exploration of how warrior cultures turned violence into entertainment. Now, let's journey back to the age of longships and blood feuds and discover the traditions that made even hardened medieval Christians recoil in horror. To understand Viking blood sports and brutal traditions, we must first grasp their worldview. The Norse believed that courage in the face of death determined one's fate in the afterlife. A warrior who died bravely in battle would be chosen by the Valkyries to feast in Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where they would fight and feast until Ragnarok, the end of the world. But a coward who died in bed from old age or disease would go to hell, a cold and miserable realm of shadows. This theology made the manner of death supremely important, and it created a culture that celebrated violence and tested courage through increasingly extreme practices. The blood eagle stands as the most infamous Viking execution method, though modern historians debate whether it was actually performed or merely a literary invention. The sagas, Icelandic texts written centuries after the Viking Age, describe the ritual in gruesome detail. The victim would be placed face down, and the executioner would use a sharp axe or sword to cut the ribs away from the spine on both sides. The ribs would then be pulled outward and backward, creating a shape resembling wings spread from the victim's back. But the horror didn't end there. According to the sagas, the lungs would be pulled out through the openings and spread across the rib wings, creating an image of a bloody eagle with outstretched wings. Salt would be rubbed into the wounds, both to increase pain and as a symbolic purification. The entire process was performed while the victim was still alive and conscious, with death coming only after the lungs were extracted and could no longer function. The saga accounts specify that the victim had to endure this torture without crying out or showing weakness. If they screamed or begged for mercy, it was believed they would be denied entry to any afterlife realm, condemned to wander as a dishonored spirit forever. This psychological dimension added another layer of cruelty. The victim had to participate in their own torture by remaining stoic or face eternal damnation. Recent archaeological and medical analysis has examined whether the blood eagle was physically possible or if it was merely a poetic exaggeration. Forensic experts have concluded that while the basic procedure described could theoretically be performed, the victim would likely die from shock or blood loss before the ritual was completed. This has led some scholars to suggest that blood eagle descriptions in the sagas were metaphorical, or that the ritual was attempted but rarely completed as described. However, other evidence suggests the Vikings did perform extreme executions on hated enemies. Archaeological discoveries of bodies with unusual rib damage, historical accounts from Christian chroniclers describing Viking brutality, and the consistency of blood eagle references across multiple independent saga sources all point to some form of saga sources. This ritual actually occurring, even if not exactly as the literary sources describe. The blood eagle was reserved for enemies who had committed particularly offensive acts, like killing a Viking leader or breaking sacred oaths. It wasn't common execution, but rather an extreme ritual reserved for exceptional circumstances. The public nature of the execution, performed before assembled warriors and captives, served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Viking ferocity to enemies, honored the victim of the original crime being avenged, and provided entertainment and religious spectacle for the community. Beyond the blood eagle, Viking culture embraced numerous blood sports and violent traditions that were considered normal entertainment. The holmgang, or island duel, was a formalized combat system where disputes could be settled through single combat. Two men would fight on a designated piece of ground, often an island or a marked area with boundaries defined by cloaks laid on the ground. The rules varied by region and time period, but the basic structure remained consistent. Each combatant would have 3 shields. When a shield was destroyed or broken through, the fighter could grab a replacement until all 3 were gone. After that, they would fight with no defensive protection. The combat continued until one participant was seriously wounded, killed, or admitted defeat. Blood had to be spilled for honor to be satisfied. First blood wasn't enough. The wound had to be significant enough that blood fell to the ground. What made holmgang particularly brutal was that it wasn't limited to voluntary participants. A man could challenge another to holmgang over almost any dispute, property rights, insults, or even to claim another man's wife. Refusing a challenge meant being labeled a coward, a social death in Viking culture that was worse than physical death. This created a system where stronger warriors could effectively terrorize weaker men through the constant threat of combat. Professional holmgang fighters emerged, warriors who would accept payment to fight duels on behalf of others. Some of these champions became wealthy and powerful by winning dozens of duels, accumulating property and wives taken from defeated opponents. The system essentially legalized violence and extortion, wrapping brutality in a framework of honor and courage. The violence of holmgang extended beyond the immediate combatants. Witnesses would gather to watch these duels as entertainment, treating them like sporting events. Bets would be placed on the outcome. Skalds, Viking poets, would compose verses about particularly impressive fights. The entire community would participate in celebrating and normalizing ritual combat that often ended in death or permanent injury. Another Viking tradition that reveals their embrace of violence as entertainment was the practice of human sacrifice at major festivals and temple gatherings. The most detailed accounts come from Adam of Bremen, an 11th century German chronicler who described the temple at Uppsala in Sweden. According to his account, every 9 years a great festival was held where 9 males of every creature were sacrificed, including humans. The bodies were hung in a sacred grove adjacent to the temple. The sacrificial victims were usually thralls, slaves captured in raids, but could also include prisoners of war or criminals. The method of sacrifice varied. Some were hanged from trees, offering to Odin, who had hanged himself on the world tree, Yggdrasil, to gain wisdom. Others had their throats cut, their blood collected in ceremonial bowls and sprinkled on altars. And participants, some were drowned in bogs as offerings to fertility gods and goddesses. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Bodies recovered from Scandinavian peat bogs show signs of ritual killing, wounds that were carefully inflicted rather than the result of combat or accident, multiple causes of death suggesting ceremonial overkill, and burial with ritual objects. Carbon dating places many of these bog bodies in the Viking Age, confirming that human sacrifice continued well into the period of Scandinavian expansion. What distinguished Viking human sacrifice from execution was its religious context and public nature. These killings were festive occasions performed during major celebrations with the entire community participating or observing. The victims' deaths were believed to ensure good harvests, victory in battle, and the favor of the gods. The sacrifices combined religious devotion with entertainment, making violence into a communal bonding experience. The Vikings also practiced a form of blood sport involving animal fighting that could turn deadly for human participants. Bear baiting was particularly popular, where a captured bear would be chained in an arena and attacked by dogs or challenged by armed men. But the Vikings took this further by sometimes throwing unarmed slaves or prisoners into the bear pit, forcing them to fight the animal with only their bare hands or minimal weapons. These animal combat spectacles served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment during long winter months when raiding was impossible. They demonstrated the bravery of warriors willing to face dangerous animals. They disposed of unwanted slaves or prisoners in a manner that was both practical and entertaining. And they reinforced the Viking worldview that valued courage and combat ability above all other qualities. Historical accounts describe elaborate animal fight events where multiple combats would occur in sequence, building to a climax with the most dangerous animal or most skilled fighter. Wealthy jarls, Viking nobles, would compete to host the most impressive spectacles, importing exotic animals, or finding particularly fierce native predators. The crowds would drink heavily throughout these events, with violence often spilling over from the arena into fights among spectators. Another disturbing Viking tradition was the practice of wife capture and forced marriage through combat. While political marriages were common among the nobility, ordinary Vikings sometimes acquired wives through a practice called brutality, bride theft. A man seeking a wife would organize a raid on a neighboring village or foreign settlement, capturing women to bring back as wives. But the captured woman wasn't simply forced into immediate marriage. Viking custom often required the captor to prove his worthiness by surviving challenges from the woman's male relatives, if any survived the raid, or from other men in his own community who might want to claim her instead. This could result in combat that was part of the wedding festivities, with the bride as the prize. These forced marriage combats were public events with the entire community attending. The fights could be to first blood or to submission, but serious injuries were common. The woman had no say in the proceedings, her fate determined entirely by which man won the fight. After the combat, the wedding would proceed immediately, with the victor claiming his prize regardless of the bride's consent. The Vikings also embraced a practice called einvigi, single combat to the death, which differed from holmgang in its lack of formal rules or restrictions. When blood feuds escalated beyond resolution through compensation or mediation, families might agree to settle the matter through einvigi. Champions from each family would fight with no rules, no boundaries, and no option for surrender. The combat continued until one fighter was dead. These death matches were considered entertainment as much as justice. The entire community would turn out to watch, with the fight often occurring at a thing, the Viking assembly, where legal and political matters were decided. The einvigi would be the main event, with legal proceedings pausing so everyone could observe the combat. Skalds would memorize the details to compose poems about particularly impressive fights. What made einvigi especially brutal was that it often didn't end with the death of one champion. Blood feuds could continue across generations, with each side seeking revenge for previous losses. This created cycles of violence where families would be locked in generations-long conflicts, periodically producing champions to fight death matches that only added more grievances to the tally. The Viking practice of berserkergang, going berserk, represents perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of their warrior culture. Berserkers were warriors who entered trance-like states before and during combat, fighting with inhuman strength and apparent immunity to pain. Historical accounts describe berserkers biting their shields, howling like animals, and attacking with such ferocity that they terrified both enemies and allies. Modern theories about berserkergang include possibilities of psychoactive substance use, perhaps mushrooms containing psilocybin, or fly agaric, psychological conditioning, creating dissociative states, or rare medical conditions like porphyria that could explain some symptoms. Whatever the cause, Berserkers were valued warriors who were also feared, and sometimes isolated, because their violence could be uncontrollable. Berserkers were sometimes unleashed as entertainment at feasts or gatherings, fighting each other or against multiple normal warriors in spectacles designed to demonstrate their superhuman abilities. These fights were brutal, even by Viking standards, with berserkers suffering horrific injuries that they appeared not to notice until after their trance state ended. Some accounts describe berserkers dying from wounds they sustained during their frenzy, their bodies finally registering damage that adrenaline or altered consciousness had masked. The integration of berserkers into Viking society reveals how they celebrated extreme violence as a desirable trait. Parents might identify children showing berserker tendencies and encourage this development through training and ritual practices. Communities would support berserkers despite the danger they posed, because their combat effectiveness was so valuable in warfare and raids. The Vikings practiced a form of judicial combat called skikja, cloak fighting, for settling minor disputes. Combatants would be tied together with a rope, or would each hold opposite ends of a cloak, forcing them to fight at close quarters with knives or short swords. The restricted movement and close proximity meant injuries were virtually guaranteed, with deaths being common despite the disputes often being over relatively trivial matters. Skikja was considered entertainment suitable for all ages, with children present at these combats learning that violence was the proper way to settle disagreements. The community would gather around the fighting men, shouting encouragement and making wagers on the outcome. Winners gained not only resolution of the dispute, but also increased status, while losers, if they survived, faced shame and diminished standing in the community. Viking funeral practices also incorporated violence in ways that served as public entertainment and demonstration of devotion. When a great warrior or jarl died, a slave woman might volunteer or be selected to die with him, serving him in the afterlife. Arab chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan provided a detailed eyewitness account of such a funeral around 922 CE. The slave woman would be ritually prepared over several days, given honored treatment and intoxicating drinks. On the funeral day, she would be passed among the deceased man's friends and family, each man having intercourse with her while she proclaimed she did this out of love for her master. Finally, she would be strangled with a cord and stabbed repeatedly before being placed beside her master on the funeral ship, which would be set ablaze. This practice combined human sacrifice, sexual violence, and public spectacle into a funeral ritual that the Vikings considered honorable and appropriate. The slave woman's death was considered a gift to her master and entertainment for the assembled community. That such brutality could be wrapped in concepts of loyalty and honor reveals how deeply violence was embedded in Viking culture. The scale of Viking blood sports and violent traditions is difficult to quantify precisely, but historical evidence suggests these practices were widespread and regular occurrences rather than rare events. Every major gathering, whether religious festival, legal assembly, or victory celebration, incorporated violent entertainment. Communities too small to host elaborate spectacles would still practice holmgang and other ritual combats as normal parts of dispute resolution. The psychological impact of growing up in such a culture cannot be understated. Viking children were exposed to extreme violence from early ages, learning that courage meant not flinching from bloodshed, and that honor was worth dying for. This conditioning created successive generations of warriors who genuinely believed that dying violently in combat was preferable to peaceful old age, perpetuating a cycle of violence that lasted for centuries. The Vikings' justification for these brutal traditions rested on their religious beliefs and value system. Violence wasn't seen as problematic, but as natural and even sacred. The gods themselves were warriors who would die fighting at Ragnarok. Odin gathered the bravest fallen warriors to his hall. Thor fought giants and monsters. The entire Norse cosmology celebrated combat, making blood sports and ritual violence seem like participation in divine patterns, rather than human cruelty. When Christianity spread through Scandinavia from the 10th to 12th centuries, Missionaries specifically targeted these violent traditions as pagan practices that needed to be eliminated. The success of Christianization in reducing Viking brutality was mixed. While some practices like human sacrifice were effectively ended, others like holmgang persisted in modified forms for centuries. The deep cultural investment in violence as entertainment and dispute resolution proved difficult to eradicate. The legacy of Viking blood sports extends into modern times through various channels. Medieval European judicial duels derived partly from Viking holmgang traditions. The romantic mythologization of Vikings in 19th and 20th century popular culture often sanitized their violence or presented it as heroic rather than barbaric. Modern entertainment industries' fascination with Viking themes frequently emphasizes their warrior culture, while downplaying the systematic brutality that culture entailed. So tell us, which Viking blood sport tradition do you find most disturbing? The blood eagle that turned execution into ritualized torture? The holmgang that weaponized social pressure to force combat? The human sacrifices performed as religious festivals? The animal fights that included human victims? The forced marriage combats that treated women as prizes? The berserkers who were conditioned into controllable madness? Or the funeral sacrifices that combined murder with religious devotion? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this journey into Viking brutality has gripped you, subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration of how warrior cultures justified the unjustifiable. Until then, remember that the Vikings we celebrate in popular culture as adventurous heroes were also perpetrators of systematic violence that they considered not just acceptable, but sacred and